Reactive Training Systems.
Hey everyone, I'm Ross Lepolo, one of the assistant coaches here with Reactive Training Systems. We get lots of questions all the time, and I wanted to take a moment to address one of them that I find interesting, that's fun to play with, and or address and speak on it. And it is, if you're a sumo puller and your competition deadlift is a sumo style, should you train that sumo style with the variations with your accessory and supplemental variations, or should you pull them conventionally? So first, I think in an ideal setting, if your competition deadlift is a sumo style deadlift, then your accessory deadlifts are going to be sumo style as well. The way we define accessory versus supplemental is an accessory lift is going to be a lift that mimics the same movement pattern. So a 2-count pause deadlift, a deficit deadlift, a deadlift with chains, things of that matter. The movement pattern's the same, but there's a slight twist or variation. Whereas supplemental exercises are going to be more targeted at muscle groups, and it's not going to have the same movement pattern. So like a good morning or a Romanian deadlift or a front squat compared to a back squat, things of that nature. So the supplemental exercises historically are going to be what they are. You know, most of the time you don't really do an RDL with a sumo style, you do it with a conventional stance. Same thing with good mornings. That doesn't necessarily always have to be the case, but historically that's how at least I approach it. I do use a little bit of like wide stance good mornings and or like wide stance good morning to pins, but I don't really ever do any other wide stance variations on the supplement lifts as far as Romanian deadlifts or snatch grip RDL. That would be, I think, snatch grip real weird to try and do that with a sumo stance. So in an ideal setting, that's typically how I approach it. Sumo's the comp, sumo's the accessory, and then probably more whatever the stance historically is conventionally with the other supplemental lifts. When the situation isn't always ideal, there's other things that can be done. Say a lifter, their hips get beat up from too high a frequency of sumo deadlifting, and there's things you can do with that. You can train conventionally more frequently and not always just constantly training sumo deadlifts, but that's not always necessarily productive to the sumo deadlift. So another way around that is you can train your competition sumo deadlift, and then you can also have a conventional stance on the accessory lifts as well as the supplemental lifts, and it gives your back, or it gives your hips rather, a little bit of a break. So there is that benefit. You can also probably apply the same logic the other direction as well. If your competition lift is the sumo deadlift, you can apply all that same logic to it, and you could train the sumo deadlift for your competition deadlift, you could train your competition conventional deadlift and then sumo as the accessory. It's often a strategy that I also use when trying to see which style a lifter responds best to, is run those simultaneously, and you can kind of see how they trend together. It's also oftentimes beneficial to have a little bit of a break in there, particularly in between development blocks, during pivot blocks and things of that nature, but sometimes even more than that. Sometimes a lifter will benefit from just doing a development cycle with the alternate stance to give their body a little bit of a break from the always repetitive motion of either sumo or conventional. I found that probably a little bit more particularly true for a competition conventional deadlift than a competition sumo deadlift. But a lot of those rules, so to speak, can be applied towards either style. And really, at the end of the day, like, none of that stuff is necessarily a rule either. They're just kind of like guidelines and things that you can do and play with, and we're all going to be and respond a little bit differently. So playing with them to see what benefits you, the lifter, the most is perfectly fine and perfectly normal. You don't have to feel like everything has to be a sumo stance or everything has to be a conventional stance. You can play with that, and you can make those, and you can manipulate those different variables and considerations. Wish maybe there could be a more like direct yes or no, black and white kind of answer to some of those things, but unfortunately there's not. There's a lot of gray area, and there's a lot of tinkering and playing that one can do with a lot of those different variations. So hopefully some of that information you find beneficial in applying to your own training, and we'll see you on the next episode of Answering Some Questions.
Reactive Training Systems.